question arises whether default is 3,600 seconds.
You're still better than finding out a month later.
Yeah.
Now, coming back to PDUs for a second, another thing that can go wrong is, especially as most servers has redundant power supplies, you have two different PDUs. So you've got your machines named 1 to 10, you've got the 10 ports, and you've got them in 1 to 10. Sometime along the line, you have a junior admin come in who's replacing one of the PDUs, and he takes 2 and plugs it into 3, takes 3 and plugs it into 2 on the backup. Still gets it right on the first one. Now you come back to your PDU, you pull the power, it cuts outlets 3 and 3 to kill node 3, but node 3's second power supply is plugged into port 2. It's still up. So the ultimate statement here really is make sure you do periodic testing with your fencing. Your fencing is critical to the stability of your cluster and requires, like everything else, periodic checks. Now, Pacemaker is getting much better at it. RG Manager is a little bit older in that regards. But
what you still want to make sure, though, is that this is a general rule that we basically recommend to all customers by default, is that if you have a high availability cluster, test hard failover at least once a quarter. That's a good estimate, and that will make sure that you're testing your fencing devices and everything, and that's a pretty good frequency. Yes.
Couldn't I get the agent to do like a test for you, like shut down one of the power supplies via remote tool for the server, so that it could remotely check with a PDU that it really shut down the port that was assigned to that server?
In Pacemaker, yes, we can do that.
in Red Hat you can as well.
In Pacemaker, it's actually really neat because you just use the CRM shell and say CRM node fence node name, and that way you manually initiate a fencing action.
Then you really fancy it. I think
yeah, I want to test if I shut down power supply A, that it really goes to that PDA and PDU port, and then I turn it on again, and then I shut down the power supply B, and then I check if it's the correct port on the PDU as well.
Well, you can still test that, but you wouldn't do that from within Pacemaker.
Why not? Why not? I would like to automate that. But I think that's a problem with Pacemaker, because you cannot tell Pacemaker when you want to fence this node, you have to do 2 fencing actions, and both have to be successful. Because you could then, by knowing, fence power supply A, fence power supply B, and then you know it's dead. And for testing, you just fence 1 and check if it's done. And that doesn't bring actually down your service. I think that was what he was talking about.
Okay, well,
on the roadmap is like advanced fencing logic, like you're suggesting. So, a device to fence a node, you need to call device A and B or C. So, fabric fencing and network fencing or power fencing.
That would also give us the opportunity to bring up a reliable service again after fabric fencing, because then I do the fencing for the storage device, and I cut off some additional network links, and that's it. Yeah?
Well, to answer your earlier question, you can already, it's very easy to test it, because you can, like for example, for Pacemaker or Stoned, you can just invoke that directly, just not directly from the Pacemaker.
In Red Hat, excuse me, in Red Hat it's the same. There's a command line tool called fence node. So generally whenever I build a cluster, I always insist on IPMI and PDUs, because I just don't like any single points of failure. The BDUs that he's talking about on the IPMI is definitely making it a lot more reliable, but it's still not 100%. So generally what I'll do when I'm going to test a node is I first make sure everything's up and running, and I just call fence node space target, and it goes down. Wait for it to come back up, rejoin the cluster, and then instead of calling fence node directly, what I do is I log into the PDU, and I pull the power to the server. Now I know the IPMI board is dead. Then I wait for the cluster to detect the fault. It will detect it, call a fence, try IPMI, I'll see that fail, and then I'll see it succeed on the second attempt. Now to your question earlier about having the fact that a fence action requires a fence method requires 2 actions with 2 PDUs. In RG Manager's world, you define a method, and a method you can have 1 or more actions. So, for example, if you have your IPMI as your first method, you have method, IPMI, just 1 entry. And then close that method, start the next method, and then you have 2 PDU actions, close the method. And all members have to succeed for the entire method to be considered successful.
How do you formulate it in Pacemaker?
You haven't yet. Okay.
after a fencing action has happened and we have successfully excluded a node from the cluster, we ultimately, of course, want to bring it back. So we have to have a facility of rejoining the cluster, and luckily and not surprisingly, both of the cluster managers that we're talking about do have that. What they both have in common is that basically the returning cluster node must basically start from a clean slate. So it has no local cluster status, so to speak. In Pacemaker, we have a node status cycle, more or less. In the fencing case, that goes from the node is online, and then the node is no longer responding, which we call unclean, and it's being fenced off. That's what we call offline. And then it comes back up and can then rejoin the cluster. When that happens, it basically discards its local information, its local knowledge of the cluster status, and also of the cluster configuration, because after all, that cluster configuration may have changed in the meantime while it was outside of the cluster. And then basically refetches all of that information via an update of, in Pacemaker, this is called the cluster information base. So that's basically everything that the cluster knows about itself, that is its configuration and its status. And then the node can properly rejoin the cluster. And in Red Hat cluster, it's very similar.
Yeah, in Red Hat cluster, if you've isolated a machine and then you've cleared it, be it through fabric fencing or FenceApp manual, which please don't ever use, but if you do, and you then try to take that node, which hasn't been power cycled, and try to rejoin it to the node or to the cluster, you'll see the cluster reject it, saying node tried to join with the existing state. So they don't set specifically like a dirty flag, but simply by the mere fact that the node has some concept of a cluster configuration, we know that it's not clean and we reject it from rejoining. It has to be clear. Restart the node or restart the cluster stack. Then join the cluster, you're golden.
I want to add one more thing because it's something that Don asked me over lunch and it's probably relevant to most people. When you're running a two-node cluster, which is sort of a special case because in a two-node cluster we can never really work with the concept of quorum. If you have a two-node cluster and you actually have all of the cluster communications severed between these nodes, this is something that clearly shouldn't happen, but if it does, you have to have a story for it. So if you have these two nodes and you have all of the cluster communications between those interrupted, then basically both of them will start shooting the other guy, which generally is fine because the fencing action is synchronous and we will only ever return from fencing when we've made sure that our peer node is in fact properly exiled. But, so they won't turn each other off at the same time, not least because a fencing action, node fencing action, is never a graceful shutdown for obvious reasons. You can't just give it an ACPI power button event and then wait for both to shut down, because we would initiate both at the same time and then they would happily shut down and we would have a no availability cluster, which clearly isn't the point. But we would have one guy shoots the other, both guys start shooting each other, only one guy wins, the other guy survives. Now, the guy that goes down eventually comes back up, and now if at this point the cluster communication is still severed, then he will now try to shoot the other guy, and then we basically get this famous node flapping ping pong, which we typically don't want. There's two ways to mitigate this. One way is to just always use the channel that you're communicating over for fencing as an additional cluster communications channel. That is to say, anytime you are severing everything, then fencing is also not going to work. Right? So you're mitigating the one problem, or you're eliminating the one problem, but then again, if really everything breaks, then your cluster is just going to freeze and fencing is not going to work. But that's one way of doing it. And the other way of doing it, and this is something that, that's actually something that many professional services organizations recommend, is you simply don't bring up your cluster services on system boot. So anytime one of the nodes is actually fenced, you will typically have some form of notification. Your cluster is going to continue running on that one remaining node, but you still want to, because let's face it, you want to ultimately find out and investigate what the cause of this breakage is, because you really don't want it to happen again. And so you have to have some form of manual intervention anyway, and you might as well go ahead and say, okay, now I'm going to investigate the problem. When everything is fine, then I'm bringing up the cluster services on startup again. Yes.
And the third way is to use off instead of reboot.
Or add a third node.
That is so true. Yeah. Well, I was talking specifically about the kind. Yeah. And that is true. Another way of doing that is to just simply turn it off instead of rebooting. However, it's still that doesn't keep you from. I mean, it's now off. You can bring it back up, but that doesn't guarantee that the cluster communication is reinstated.
Yeah. One last comment: if you have a SAN and you're running under Red Hat cluster, you can use a quorum desk on the 2 node, which acts as basically a tiebreaker. And we've already gotten a 1-minute warning. So
that is right. Yeah. LMB, who's not here today, said, "How can you possibly talk about fencing for an hour?" We've just run out of time, so here's how. However, of course, we'll be hanging around. Both Madison and I are going to be here until tomorrow, so we're easy to find the whole day today. These are our email addresses, not our IP addresses. Our email addresses, so you can always find us there. Madison has her personal home on the interwebs at altiv.com, and the other URL below there is our shoutbox. This is basically whenever we do community work, as in have helped someone out on a mailing list or on IRC, or helped someone at a conference, here's where you can come, leave a comment, and that's a simple and easy way to get in touch with us. And finally, since our historical background is all CC by SA licensed, here are the photo credits for the respective Flickr users. We thank you very much for your kind attention, and we'll hang around. Thank you.
thank you very much.